I only started dusting the silver tray to clear my head after our maid was suddenly fired. But what slipped from beneath it was not dust. It was a hastily scribbled note that changed my marriage in just 2 seconds. She did not ask for help or explain. She simply left a chilling command to check under my husband's office carpet. Following her instructions proved I was merely the final asset in a flawlessly calculated scheme. My name is Lydia Garcia. I am 36 years old, and until 7 days ago, I believed my life was an impenetrable fortress of stability. My husband, Nolan Pierce, and I resided in a sprawling modern coastal estate in St. Petersburg, Florida. Our home was a breathtaking structure of glass and imported stone that overlooked the dark waters of the Gulf. Yet despite the floor-to-ceiling windows designed to bathe every room in natural light, the house always harbored a strange, sterile coldness. It felt less like a sanctuary and more like a high-end museum where nothing was meant to be touched. I was the chief operating officer at Harbor Light Recovery Alliance, a prominent private relief fund. My entire career was built on vigilance. I managed tens of millions of dollars in disaster relief, coordinating massive logistical operations to rebuild coastal communities after hurricanes. I was trained to scrutinize every contract, spot discrepancies, and detect the faintest whiff of corruption before a system collapsed. I was an expert at finding hidden faults. Yet, I was entirely blind to the massive fracture running directly beneath my own feet. The first tremor struck exactly 1 week ago. Teresa Wynn, our quiet, loyal housekeeper of over 5 years, was terminated with brutal suddenness. I was not even home when it happened. I had been working a grueling 14-hour shift, managing the chaotic fallout of a recent storm surge. When I finally pulled my car into our driveway that evening, the house felt disturbingly hollow. I found Nolan in the kitchen, casually pouring a generous measure of expensive scotch. His posture was relaxed, but his jaw was locked tight. He informed me, without emotion, that he had let Teresa go. When I asked why, he calmly stated she had crossed unacceptable boundaries. He claimed he had caught her snooping around his private study, going through his desk drawers. He looked me dead in the eye and said he could not tolerate a breach of trust in our private sanctuary. At the time, my confusion was heavy, but it did not metastasize into suspicion. Teresa was a devout, soft-spoken woman who practically glided through our home. The idea of her maliciously snooping through Nolan's confidential documents felt wildly out of character, but I was physically drained. I did not have the energy to fight him. When I suggested we contact an agency the next morning to find a replacement, Nolan instantly shut the idea down. He claimed he was tired of having strangers walking through our intimate spaces. He insisted he wanted the house to be completely ours for a few weeks, free from hired help. That rigid insistence was the reason I found myself standing in our cavernous formal living room on a Saturday morning, a microfiber cloth in my hand. The house was suffocatingly silent. The massive central air conditioning unit hummed a low drone that vibrated against my teeth. I moved toward the heavy console table near the entryway to wipe down a large, ornate silver tray. It was a bulky, antique piece Nolan had insisted on buying at an estate auction 2 years prior. I grasped the thick edges of the silver and lifted it slightly to dust underneath. As the heavy metal cleared the polished mahogany surface, a small, folded square of paper slipped from the recessed rim on the underside. It fluttered down, landing silently on the dark wood. It had been wedged so perfectly into the narrow gap beneath the tray that it was completely invisible unless you physically lifted the object. My fingers felt strangely numb as I picked up the paper. It was a cheap, lined sheet torn roughly from a small spiral grocery notepad. I unfolded it slowly. The handwriting hit me like a physical blow to the chest. It was undeniably Teresa's script, but the usually neat cursive was erratic, jagged, and pressed so furiously into the thin paper that the blue ink had bled violently through to the other side. The words were not a plea for her job. They were a chilling, desperate command. "Check under your husband's office carpet." I did. "Do not let him see you reading this." I stopped breathing. the oxygen in the vast living room suddenly turned into concrete. A profound, paralyzing chill bloomed at the base of my spine and radiated outward, leaving my skin covered in a cold sweat. It was not just the terrifyingly specific instruction that made my stomach drop. It was the certainty that Teresa was incapable of theatrical revenge. She was a woman who lived her life terrified of drawing attention. For her to plant a hidden message, knowing the risk if Nolan found it first, meant she had stumbled onto something monstrous. She had seen something that terrified her so deeply, she risked everything to warn me. I crushed the small piece of paper in my fist and shoved it deep into the pocket of my trousers. My gaze slowly drifted down the long, shadowed corridor that led to Nolan's private office. The heavy mahogany door at the end of the hall suddenly looked like the steel door of a vault. A sickening wave of clarity washed over me. A cascade of bizarre, microscopic details from the past 4 months, details I had willingly brushed aside, suddenly rushed into my mind with terrifying focus. Nolan had become aggressively territorial about that specific room. He had abruptly called a locksmith to install a heavy-duty deadbolt, claiming he was handling sensitive corporate acquisitions that required ultimate security. He began working from home almost every single day, locking himself inside that room for 10 or 12 hours at a stretch. He grew furious if anyone, even me, lingered near the door. If I brought him a cup of coffee, he would practically shove the door open, step quickly into the hallway, snatch the mug from my hand, and pull the door shut behind him, physically blocking my line of sight. He had strictly forbidden me from touching his mail, moving his briefcase, or emptying the small trash bin near his desk. I had rationalized every single red flag. I had told myself he was merely navigating a high-pressure phase in his career. I had played the role of the patient, accommodating wife, trusting that his secrets were just business strategies. Now, feeling the hard little knot of the hidden note in my pocket, that naive trust curdled into pure dread. Every locked door, every sudden change in routine, every flash of irritation when I came too close was part of a design. I was living inside a carefully constructed lie. My bare feet made no sound against the imported hardwood as I walked slowly down the hallway. Every step felt agonizingly heavy. The silence of the house was no longer just quiet. It felt predatory. I reached the end of the corridor and wrapped my trembling hand around the cold brass knob of the office door. I twisted it. It yielded. He had left it unlocked in his arrogant rush to make his morning golf tea time. I pushed the heavy door open and stepped over the threshold. The room immediately assaulted my senses. It smelled of rich leather, stale espresso, and a faint, metallic odor. The thick velvet curtains were drawn tightly shut, suffocating the natural light and casting the entire space in a perpetual twilight. My eyes bypassed the massive oak desk and the locked filing cabinets. My gaze locked directly onto the floor. A sprawling, intricately woven Persian carpet covered almost the entire expanse of the room. Its dark red and navy patterns suddenly looked like a complex labyrinth designed to hide a trap. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I dropped to my knees near the corner of the heavy desk. The wool of the carpet was coarse and thick under my trembling fingers. I reached out, my fingernails digging into the dense fibers, preparing to pull back the heavy fabric and expose whatever cancer was growing beneath my home. My fingertips had barely curled around the thick fringe when a sound ripped through the suffocating silence. It was the sharp, metallic snap of the front door deadbolt retracting, followed instantly by the heavy groan of the solid wood door swinging open. The blood in my veins turned to ice. Nolan was home. He was not supposed to return from the golf course for at least another 3 hours. Panic, sharp and metallic, exploded behind my eyes. I scrambled backward, my knees scraping painfully against the rough carpet. I lunged to my feet, snatching the yellow microfiber cloth I had absent-mindedly carried with me. I threw myself toward the nearest towering bookshelf and began violently rubbing the cloth against the polished wood shelves, my hands shaking so violently that I knocked a heavy crystal paperweight perilously close to the edge. Heavy, deliberate footsteps echoed ominously down the long hardwood hallway. They were moving fast, unhesitating, heading directly for the office. The mahogany door, which I had left slightly ajar, swung open violently, the brass knob slamming into the drywall with a sickening thud. Nolan stood framed in the doorway. He was dressed in his crisp white golf polo and tailored shorts, looking every bit the affluent husband, but the posture was entirely wrong. There was no weekend relaxation in his shoulders. His body was a coiled spring. His sharp eyes darted rapidly across the room, taking in my position, tracking down to the corner of the carpet, and then snapping back to my pale face. For one terrifying fraction of a second, the charming mask of the man I had married completely dissolved. What lay beneath was a flash of cold, calculating, predatory rage. His handsome features contorted into something ugly and unrecognizable. His jaw clenched with such sudden force that I could see a thick muscle ticking erratically near his temple. He looked as if he wanted to destroy me right then and there. Then, almost faster than my mind could process it, the mask snapped back into place. The rage vanished, replaced by an eerie, glacial calm that was infinitely more terrifying. He slowly stepped into the dimly lit room, his sheer presence seeming to suck the remaining oxygen out of the stagnant air. He did not shout. He did not make any sudden movements. He stood perfectly still, his eyes boring into mine with dead, emotionless intensity. When he finally spoke, his voice was not angry. It was a soft, silken whisper, pitched incredibly low, cutting through the heavy silence like a surgical scalpel. "Do not come in here again. I will not say it twice." The sunrise brought absolutely no relief. At 7 o'clock the next morning, I performed the familiar choreography of my daily routine as if my entire world had not violently shifted off its axis. I poured his dark roast coffee, tied the silk belt of my trench coat, and kissed his cheek with lips that felt entirely numb. I drove toward the Harbor Light Recovery Alliance headquarters, but I never merged onto the highway. Instead, I circled the neighborhood for exactly 45 minutes. I parked 3 streets over, hiding my car behind a row of thick oak trees, and watched the main road. At precisely 8:15, Nolan's sleek black sedan glided past my hiding spot, heading downtown. The moment his taillights vanished around the bend, my heart began a violent, erratic rhythm against my ribs. I had to go back. I had to know what was in that room by any means necessary. The house was suffocatingly quiet when I unlocked the front door. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like a gunshot. I walked straight to the office. The echo of his voice from the previous afternoon still vibrated in the stagnant air, warning me never to step foot inside again. I turned the brass knob. The door clicked open. The heavy velvet curtains were still drawn shut, trapping the smell of stale leather and male cologne. I did not hesitate this time. I walked directly to the center of the room, dropped to my knees, and grabbed the thick woolen edge of the massive Persian carpet. It was incredibly heavy, resisting my grip as I dug my heels into the floor and hauled it backward. The friction burned my palms, but I kept pulling until the dark hardwood beneath was completely exposed. At first glance, the floor looked entirely seamless. But as I crawled closer, tracing my fingertips along the polished grain, I felt a microscopic drop in elevation. It was an access panel, cut with absolute surgical precision to blend into the natural lines of the oak planks. There was a tiny concealed latch nestled in the dark groove. I pressed my thumbnail into the mechanism and pulled upward. A heavy square of flooring lifted away, revealing a dark, shallow cavity recessed directly into the foundation. My breath caught in my throat. My mind had spent the entire night conjuring images of what a deceitful husband might hide. I expected a secondary burner phone, explicit photographs, or perhaps bundles of untraceable cash. What lay inside the dark hollow was infinitely worse. It was a meticulously organized damage control dossier, and the subject of the dossier was me. I reached into the cold cavity and pulled out a thick stack of manila folders. My hands shook so violently that the papers rustled against each other like dry leaves. I flipped open the first cover. The top sheet was a standard Harbor Light Recovery Alliance disbursement authorization form. It detailed a massive transfer of emergency relief funds meant for coastal rebuilding efforts, but my eyes instantly locked onto the bottom right corner of the page. There, pressed in stark black ink, was my electronic signature. It was the exact digital stamp I used to approve final payouts, but the date printed next to my name made the blood drain entirely from my face. The document claimed I had authorized this transfer on the 14th of October. I remembered that exact date vividly. I had been standing at a podium at a disaster management conference in Atlanta, Georgia, hundreds of miles away from the secure server where that signature was housed. I frantically flipped through the rest of the stack. There were dozens of identical forms. Millions of dollars had been funneled out of our relief fund, all bearing my unauthorized seal of approval, all dated on days when my schedule placed me completely out of the office or entirely out of the state. I dug deeper into the compartment. My trembling fingers brushed against cold metal. I pulled out a small, heavy silver USB drive and a dull brass padlock key. They were sitting on top of a glossy, high-resolution map of the coastal shoreline. Several large plots of waterfront land were aggressively circled in thick red ink. But it was the final object in the recess that made my lungs stop working entirely. It was a slim, black folder. A crisp white label was affixed to the center. Typed in neat, bold letters were 3 devastating words. Lydia Exposure Sequence. I opened the black folder. Inside was a massive, multi-page spreadsheet. My name was highlighted in blinding yellow across every single row. The columns detailed a labyrinth of financial transfers. I was listed as the sole approving officer for a relentless stream of payouts directed toward a network of ghost companies I had absolutely no knowledge of. Entities with vague, corporate names like Bayhaven Acquisitions and Coastal Restructuring Partners were absorbing staggering amounts of disaster relief capital, and the paper trail was flawlessly designed to end directly at my desk. Then, a small square of bright yellow paper fluttered out from between the spreadsheet pages and landed on my lap. It was a handwritten sticky note. The script was Nolan's elegant, slanted handwriting. The ink was fresh, the stroke confident and aggressive. The words written on that small yellow square dismantled my entire reality in a matter of seconds. Audit window in 19 days. If pressure rises, let Lydia absorb first impact. The room started to spin. The oxygen felt thick and completely unbreathable. This was not a simple case of corporate embezzlement. This was not a secret financial crime where the perpetrator simply hoped to remain hidden. This was a sprawling, highly structured architecture of ruin. Nolan had not just stolen from the foundation. He had spent months, perhaps years, meticulously constructing a narrative where I was the mastermind. The timeline was already set. In exactly 19 days, the internal auditors would descend, the discrepancies would be triggered, and the entire devastating weight of a federal investigation would fall squarely onto my shoulders. He was not just lying to me. He was actively preparing a prison cell with my name on it. A primal, suffocating terror gripped my throat, but beneath that terror, a cold, sharp instinct for survival flared to life. If I confronted him now, I would be destroyed. He had the documents, he had the narrative. I had absolutely nothing but the clothes on my back and a terrible realization. I had to move fast. I pulled my phone from my pocket and opened the camera. My hands were vibrating, but I forced my arms to lock tight against my sides to stabilize the lens. I snapped rapid, clear photographs of the disbursement forms, making sure my forged signatures and the conflicting dates were completely legible. I photographed the sprawling coastal map and the horrifying spreadsheet of the ghost companies. I did not dare take the original papers. His trap was set, and any missing piece would instantly alert him that his prey had seen the cage. I only allowed myself to take one single, small payment receipt from the very bottom of the stack, folding it tightly and shoving it deep into my pocket as hard physical proof. I slipped the heavy silver USB drive from the floorboard cavity and slid it securely up the tight sleeve of my silk blouse. I reached for the thick stack of papers in the black folder, stacking them with obsessive precision so the edges aligned perfectly, exactly as I had found them. I placed them back into the dark recess alongside the brass key and the map. I gently lowered the wooden access panel, pressing down until I heard the faint, satisfying click of the concealed latch engaging. Standing up required every ounce of strength I possessed. My knees felt like water. I grabbed the edge of the heavy Persian carpet and dragged it forward, smoothing out the thick wool until it covered the seam in the floorboards without a single wrinkle or fold. I backed away, my eyes sweeping the room, checking the position of the desk chair, the angle of the velvet curtains, erasing every possible sign of my presence. I stepped out into the hallway and pulled the heavy mahogany door shut until the latch clicked silently into place. As I walked swiftly toward the front door to leave the house, the silence no longer felt empty. It felt loaded. I knew with absolute, terrifying certainty that my husband was not just an unfaithful partner hiding a few secrets. He was an executioner, and he had already sharpened the blade for my neck. I returned to my office at Harbor Light Recovery Alliance shortly after 1 o'clock in the afternoon. The sterile, fluorescent lighting of the corporate hallway felt like an interrogation room. My colleagues walked past me, discussing supply chains and disaster relief logistics, completely unaware that the woman they reported to was actively being framed for a massive financial crime. I nodded and smiled, my facial muscles burning from the effort of maintaining the facade. The very first rule of survival was absolute containment. If Nolan was monitoring my digital footprint, and I had to assume he was, using my personal cell phone or my office computer to make contact was a death sentence. I waited until my operations manager stepped out for a late lunch. He always left his secondary field phone charging on his desk. I slipped into his cubicle, unplugged the device, and locked myself inside a stall in the women's restroom. My hands shook as I typed the digits. I had memorized Teresa's number from the employee emergency contact file months ago. I sent a single, brief text message. It simply gave an address and a time. 3:30 in the afternoon. I deleted the message, cleared the outgoing log, and returned the phone exactly as I found it. The location I chose was a decaying 24-hour laundromat situated on the industrial outskirts of the city, at least 15 miles away from our pristine coastal neighborhood. I drove in complete silence. Every time a dark sedan appeared in my rearview mirror, my breath caught in my throat. I took 4 deliberate wrong turns and circled a crowded shopping plaza twice just to ensure I was not being followed. When I finally pulled into the cracked asphalt parking lot, the afternoon sun was blinding. The laundromat smelled of cheap, synthetic floral detergent and hot, damp lint. Fluorescent bulbs hummed violently overhead, a few of them flickering with an erratic, dying rhythm. The rhythmic thumping of heavy industrial washing machines created a wall of white noise, perfect for drowning out hushed conversations. I chose a cracked orange plastic chair in the very back corner, facing the entrance. Teresa arrived exactly 10 minutes later. The bell above the glass door chimed weakly. She stepped inside, and my heart sank. Stripped of her crisp, professional housekeeper uniform, she looked incredibly fragile. She wore a faded gray cardigan and plain denim trousers. Her usually perfectly pinned hair was loose and disheveled, but it was her eyes that struck me the most. They were darting rapidly across the room, wide and hypervigilant. She looked like a woman being hunted. She spotted me in the corner and walked over quickly, her cheap sneakers squeaking against the linoleum floor. She sat down in the chair next to mine. She did not look at me. She kept her gaze fixed on the spinning drum of a dryer across the aisle. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The oppressive heat of the room pressed down on my shoulders. She spoke first, her voice barely a whisper beneath the mechanical roar of the machines. She said she knew I would never believe a single word she said unless I saw the grave he was digging with my own 2 eyes. I swallowed the dry lump in my throat and told her I saw it. I told her I saw the compartment. Teresa let out a long, shaky breath. Her hands were clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were entirely white. She began to explain, speaking in short, fragmented sentences. It happened on a Tuesday. She was doing a deep clean of the office, pushing the heavy vacuum cleaner near his desk. The thick power cord snagged hard on the fringe of the Persian carpet. She yanked it, pulling the heavy rug back much further than intended. That was when she saw the seam in the floorboards. She told me she knew she should have put the rug back immediately. Nolan had always been terrifyingly strict about his workspace, but something about the precise nature of that hidden cut in the wood made her stomach turn. She used a letter opener to pry the latch. She only opened it a few inches, just enough to peek inside. She saw a thick stack of folders, and she saw photographs of my face clipped to documents bearing the names of strange, aggressive-looking corporate entities. Panic had seized her. She dropped the wooden panel, kicked the rug back into place, and fled the room. But she was not fast enough to cover her tracks entirely. She had failed to smooth down a single, tiny wrinkle in the heavy wool. That same evening, the entire atmosphere of the house turned poisonous. Teresa recalled how Nolan walked through the front door and instantly froze. He behaved like a wolf catching a foreign scent. He did not say a word to me over dinner, but the moment I went upstairs, he began his hunt. Teresa hid in the hallway shadows. She watched him tear apart the storage room. She watched him spend over 2 hours rapidly scrolling through the security camera feeds on his tablet, his face inches from the glowing screen. The very next morning, he cornered her in the kitchen before the sun even fully rose. He shoved an envelope containing $2,000 in cash into her chest and ordered her off his property within 10 minutes. He never mentioned the carpet. He just cited boundaries. I closed my eyes, absorbing the sheer, clinical ruthlessness of my husband. But Teresa was not finished. She turned her head slightly, finally looking directly at me. Her dark eyes were brimming with unshed tears. She said there was something else, something she heard the night she found the floorboard. She had woken up shortly after midnight to get a glass of water. As she passed the dark living room, she heard Nolan standing on the outdoor patio. The sliding glass door was cracked open just an inch. He was speaking on his cell phone, his voice completely stripped of its usual charm. It was flat, transactional, and entirely lethal. Teresa remembered the exact words because they made her blood run entirely cold. He was speaking to a woman. He called her Celeste. He told this woman not to worry about the upcoming compliance checks. He said the narrative was completely locked in place, and then he delivered the sentence that would haunt me for the rest of my life. He told Celeste that when the audit finally starts, I would panic to such a degree that I would just hand him the keys to the entire operation. The name slammed into my chest like a physical blow. Celeste. Celeste Rowan was the financial commissioner on the executive board of Harbor Light Recovery Alliance. She was my mentor. She was the woman who had guided me through the complex web of nonprofit finance, the woman who had attended my wedding and bought us expensive crystal. My mind spun violently. Nolan and Celeste, my husband and my board member. They were not just having an affair. They were executing a coordinated financial slaughter. Teresa unzipped her worn leather purse with trembling fingers. She reached inside and pulled out a small, crinkled piece of glossy photo paper. She pushed it across the small plastic table separating our chairs. She said she managed to take one picture with her phone before he fired her. It was a photograph of a notebook page he had carelessly left out on the kitchen counter weeks ago, long before the carpet incident. She had printed it at a pharmacy just an hour before our meeting. I picked up the photo. It was blurry, taken in poor lighting, but the harsh, slanted handwriting was unmistakably his. It was a column of figures, millions of dollars listed in a descending row. And next to every single dollar amount, written over and over again like a sinister mantra, was a single corporate name, Bayhaven Acquisitions, LLC. The puzzle pieces violently locked into place. Bayhaven Acquisitions was not a charitable donor. They were not a legitimate partner aiding our hurricane relief efforts. They were a parasitic shell company. They were the entity receiving the massive, unauthorized payouts I had seen in the hidden folder. They were draining the relief funds, and the money was flowing directly through approvals bearing my forged signature. Teresa covered her face with her hands, letting out a stifled, broken sob. She apologized repeatedly. She said she was a coward. She said she was too terrified of his temper, too terrified of losing her livelihood, to warn me the moment she saw the files. She thought she could just stay quiet and survive. I reached out and firmly grasped her trembling hands, pulling them away from her face. I looked at this exhausted woman. I realized that for years, I had viewed her merely as the quiet background hum of my privileged life. But in reality, this woman, whom Nolan had discarded like trash for allegedly crossing a boundary, was the only person in the world who had actually tried to throw me a lifeline. I told her to stop apologizing. I told her she had just handed me the weapon I needed, the paralyzing, suffocating fear that had gripped me since I found the note under the silver tray suddenly evaporated. It was entirely replaced by something else. A cold, hyper-focused, predatory clarity. I was no longer a confused wife wandering through a terrifying house. I knew the players. I knew the stakes. I knew the timeline. Nolan thought I was blind. He thought I was weak. But he had made one fatal miscalculation. He left me alive long enough to see the board. The next morning, the Harbor Light Recovery Alliance headquarters felt less like a workplace and more like a crime scene where I was both the lead investigator and the prime suspect. I locked my office door, lowered the aluminum blinds, and deliberately bypassed my standard administrative dashboard. Instead, I dug deep into the raw back-end server logs of our post-hurricane disbursement software. I needed to see the naked digital fingerprints. What I uncovered over the next 3 hours was a masterpiece of administrative sabotage. I pulled up the exact timestamp data for every single financial payout routed to the phantom shell companies. The system recorded my unique, encrypted security token authorizing massive capital transfers at 2 a.m, a time when I was deeply asleep in our master bedroom. My work laptop securely zipped inside my briefcase downstairs. Another release of 7-figure funds was digitally stamped at 3:15 in the afternoon on a Tuesday. I cross-referenced that specific date with my archived travel itinerary. At that exact moment, I had been 30,000 feet in the air on a commercial flight over the Gulf of Mexico, aboard an aircraft equipped with absolutely no wireless internet connection. Someone had perfectly cloned my credentials. They were operating a shadow version of my professional identity, moving millions of dollars in the dark. The large calendar hanging on my wall suddenly looked like a lethal countdown timer. Our internal compliance division was scheduled to initiate a massive joint review with a state-level oversight committee in exactly 18 days. That was the precise window Nolan had calculated on his yellow sticky note. The state auditors would inevitably request the raw digital logs. They would see my unyielding administrative signature attached to every fraudulent transaction. They would see public money funneled into undocumented corporate voids. By the time federal investigators arrived with warrants, the narrative would be hermetically sealed. I would be painted as a desperate, rogue executive who siphoned disaster relief funds to enrich her own secret accounts. I shifted my intense focus to the primary beneficiary. I accessed public state business registries, routing the search through a secured proxy server to mask my location. I began peeling back the dense corporate layers of Bay Haven acquisitions. It was a classic nesting doll of limited liability companies, ultimately registered to a vacant post office box in Delaware. But as I painstakingly tracked their property deeds through county tax records, their hunting strategy became violently clear. They were not community builders. They were scavengers. Whenever a Category 4 storm decimated a vulnerable coastal zip code, Bay Haven would quietly swoop into the wreckage. They aggressively targeted working-class neighborhoods where homeowners were underinsured, traumatized, and desperate for immediate cash. They bought flooded, condemned lots for absolute pennies on the dollar. But the true, terrifying genius of the fraud lay in what happened next. Mere weeks after Bay Haven secured the deeds, Harbor Light relief grants would miraculously be approved and heavily concentrated into those exact specific zones. The public charity money paid for the expensive infrastructure repair, the municipal rezoning, and the soil stabilization. The property values artificially skyrocketed overnight. Bay Haven would then quietly flip the newly viable, prime real estate to massive commercial developers for astronomical, untraceable profits. I pulled up the geographical coordinates from the photographs I had taken inside his office. I typed the latitude and longitude into the county parcel mapping software. The screen refreshed, highlighting a jagged red polygon on the edge of the southern inlet. The breath completely vanished from my lungs. The sterile air conditioning in my office suddenly felt freezing. The room started to spin. The highlighted parcel was not a random, storm-damaged lot belonging to a stranger. It was a small, weathered cottage sitting on 3 acres of pristine waterfront property. It was the exact house my mother had left me when she passed away. I had stubbornly refused to sell it to any developers, diligently paying the exorbitant property taxes out of my own personal savings. I held on to it simply because it was the last physical tether to my childhood, a place smelling of old pine and salt spray. Suddenly, the image of a specific legal document I had photographed from the hidden floorboard flashed behind my eyes with blinding clarity. It was a draft for a sweeping, irrevocable power of attorney. The document explicitly granted Nolan full legal authority to transfer personal real estate assets on my behalf. I had initially assumed it was just another piece of the financial shield he was building to protect his own wealth when I went down for the audit. I was completely, devastatingly wrong. That meticulously forged signature was not just about hiding money. It was the final key required to legally sign away my mother's home to Bayhaven. The entire, sprawling architecture of the heist finally crystallized in my mind. Nolan was the ruthless acquisitions machine, bullying desperate homeowners and securing the cheap deeds. But he was just a private citizen. He could not direct the massive flow of charitable grants. He needed a powerful inside operator to point the heavy money hose directly at his newly acquired dirt. That was where Celeste Rowan came in. As the financial commissioner, she dictated exactly which recovery zones received priority funding. She drew the maps. Nolan bought the land. But to complete the triangle, they needed a highly credible senior executive to unknowingly authorize the physical transfer of the money. They needed a firewall made of flesh and blood. They needed me. I sat back in my heavy leather chair, staring blankly at the glowing monitor until my vision blurred. The betrayal was so absolute, so structurally flawless, that it completely transcended ordinary infidelity. It was a legal slaughter. I looked down at the heavy, flawless diamond ring resting on my left hand. A sickening wave of physical nausea washed over me as the entire timeline of our relationship began to rewrite itself in my head. I met Nolan at a charity gala roughly 4 years ago. It was Celeste who had introduced us. She had walked him over to my table, describing him as a brilliant real estate consultant who was deeply passionate about coastal preservation. Within 2 months of our first date, he had casually asked about my family history, inquiring specifically about what would happen to my mother's waterfront property. He had kindly offered to look over the deed, claiming he just wanted to ensure the taxes were optimized for my benefit. I had thought he was being protective. I had thought he was taking care of me. Every single romantic gesture, every supportive conversation after a long day at the fund, every late-night discussion about our shared future was nothing but a calculated data-gathering operation. He did not marry a woman. He acquired a strategic asset. He needed total access to the Harbor Light disbursement network. He needed those 3 acres of waterfront land to complete a massive commercial package for his developers. And he desperately needed a naive, trusting wife with a spotless reputation to take the devastating federal prison sentence when the shell game inevitably collapsed. The sharpest, most paralyzing pain in my chest was not the loss of a husband. It was the crushing, humiliating realization that my marriage had never actually existed. It was merely a hostile corporate takeover perfectly disguised as a love story, but as the tears dried tightly on my cheeks, a terrifying, absolute calm settled over my mind. If Nolan treated our sacred vows as nothing more than a legal contract to exploit, then I was going to teach him the brutal, catastrophic consequences of breaching that contract. I closed the server logs, wiped my digital search history clean, and began to outline my own ruthless terms of severance. The urge to walk straight into the FBI field office in Tampa was a screaming siren in my head. But logic, cold and unforgiving, clamped down on my panic. If I went to the authorities right then, armed with nothing more than a few blurry photographs and a crumpled receipt in my pocket, I would be destroying my own case before it ever began. Nolan was entirely embedded in the system. He would simply claim I was a hysterical, overworked executive experiencing a paranoid breakdown, or worse, attempting to frame him to cover my own embezzlements. He would wipe the servers, burn the documents beneath the floorboards, and leave me standing in front of the federal auditors with my forged signatures glaring back at me. I needed a weapon far more precise than a whistle. I needed a surgeon who specialized in corporate extraction. I found her in Nina Barrett. She was not the kind of attorney who advertised on billboards or took high-profile celebrity divorces. Nina was a phantom in the legal world, a ruthless litigator specializing in catastrophic corporate fraud and complex real estate asset recovery. She was famous in very dark, very wealthy circles for successfully freezing offshore accounts mere minutes before they could be liquidated. I contacted her through an encrypted messaging service, using a burner phone I had purchased with cash at a convenience store 2 towns over. We met on a Thursday afternoon. The location was a dimly lit, private dining room at the back of an old, heavy wood steakhouse that smelled of roasted garlic and ancient cigar smoke. Nina sat across from me, a sleek woman in her late 40s with sharp, observing eyes and absolutely zero bedside manner. I laid the single physical receipt and the printed photographs on the heavy linen tablecloth. I explained the timeline. I explained the upcoming audit window, which was now just 17 days away. Nina did not gasp or offer false sympathy. She simply tapped her manicured fingernail against the photograph of the exposure sequence folder. She told me my husband was a brilliant sociopath. But like all brilliant sociopaths, he suffered from a fatal flaw. He believed he was the smartest person in any given room. She leaned forward, her voice a low, commanding hum. She explicitly instructed me not to confront him, not to hire a private investigator who might get made, and above all, not to show a single ounce of anger. She said the absolute most dangerous opponent is the one who convinces you they have already surrendered. She told me I had to become the exact victim he had scripted me to be. I needed to act clueless, overwhelmed by the pressure of the upcoming compliance checks, and utterly dependent on his stability. The more confident he felt about his trap, the sloppier he would become with the final details. I absorbed her strategy like a soldier taking orders. The moment I left the steakhouse, I began fortifying my defenses. The fear that had paralyzed me for days hardened into a cold, unbreakable resolve. I went to a public library 3 counties away and used a secured terminal to upload the photographs of the forged documents, the ledger of ghost companies, and the coastal property map to a highly encrypted cloud server. I created 3 separate digital copies. I routed one to a secure legal server Nina provided. I sent the second to a dormant email address I had created a decade ago. The third copy was the most crucial. I engineered a deadman switch. I coded a scheduled email program that required a manual password reset every 12 hours. If I failed to log in, if I was arrested, incapacitated, or simply vanished, the entire explosive cache of evidence would automatically transmit to the State Attorney General, the Internal Revenue Service, and the lead investigative journalist at the state's largest newspaper. Next, I began quietly dismantling the financial tethers he had wrapped around my neck. During my lunch break the following Monday, I walked into a small branch of my primary bank, deliberately choosing a location Nolan never frequented. I sat across from a young manager and calmly revoked every single active financial power of attorney I had signed over the past 3 years. I told the manager I was undergoing a routine estate restructuring. Nolan had pushed me to sign those documents shortly after we were married, claiming it was merely for convenience so he could manage our joint investment portfolios while I was traveling for disaster relief deployments. It was a terrifyingly simple way to hand him the keys to my entire net worth. I did not stop there. I withdrew exactly $48,000 from an individual savings account I had maintained since before our wedding. I moved the funds into a newly established, untraceable trust account Nina had set up under a completely different corporate veil. I contacted my life insurance provider and quietly removed Nolan as the primary beneficiary, replacing him with my favorite charitable foundation. I executed every single move with microscopic precision, ensuring none of these administrative changes would trigger automated alerts to his phone or email, but I still had a massive blind spot. I could not be at the house during the day, and I needed to know exactly what he was moving in and out of that locked office. I needed eyes on the perimeter. I reached out to Teresa. She had agreed to meet me at a crowded outdoor farmers market on a Sunday morning. We walked between stalls selling organic honey and handmade soaps, speaking without looking at each other. She was terrified, but the anger at how she had been discarded was beginning to outshine her fear. I gave her a prepaid mobile phone. I asked her to park her nondescript sedan 3 blocks away from the estate, nestled in a visitor parking alcove where she had a clear line of sight to our driveway. She agreed to watch the house during his supposed home office hours. She was instructed to text me a single blank message if he brought any new boxes into the residence, or if any unknown vehicles pulled up to our gate. She became my silent sentry. The true psychological torture, however, was returning home every single evening. I had to step across the threshold and instantly slide into the skin of a woman I no longer was. I became the exhausted, stressed-out executive. I cooked his favorite meals, standing at the marble island chopping vegetables while he sat on a bar stool mere feet away, sipping expensive red wine and casually asking about my day. I complained about the upcoming internal audits, perfectly mirroring the panic he expected to see. I rubbed my temples, sighed heavily, and accepted the soothing, manipulative back rubs he offered. He would kiss the top of my head and tell me everything was going to be fine, that he would handle any legal fallout if the charity board tried to make me a scapegoat. Hearing those words fall from his mouth, knowing the absolute devastation he was actively orchestrating beneath my very feet, required a level of physical restraint I never knew I possessed. I had to force my muscles to relax under his touch. I had to force my eyes to project naive gratitude instead of absolute venom. I nodded, thanking him for being my rock. Every night, as I lay next to him in the suffocating darkness of our master bedroom, listening to the steady, rhythmic sound of his breathing, my mind ran complex probability matrices. I was no longer a victim trapped in a collapsing marriage. I was the architect of a counteroffensive. I was meticulously cataloging every lie, every forged signature, every patronizing smile. He thought he had complete control over the timeline. He believed the climax of this story was the moment the federal agents walked into my office. But behind my mask of domestic compliance, I had completely rewritten the ending. My retaliation was not going to be a messy, emotional confrontation in our living room. It was going to be a surgically timed demolition. I was just waiting for him to light the fuse. Exactly 4 days after my clandestine meeting with the attorney, the invisible snare violently tightened. The email arrived in my secure inbox at precisely 9 o'clock on a Tuesday morning. It was flagged with high urgency from the Executive Compliance Division. They were initiating an immediate, unannounced internal review of all post-storm disbursement authorizations issued over the previous 12 months. They specifically requested raw data logs for a random sampling of grants, but I knew it was not random at all. The snare was dropping exactly where the yellow sticky note had predicted. The timeline was no longer a looming threat. It was active, and the clock was rapidly ticking down to my destruction. Less than 1 hour after the company-wide email circulated, my desk phone rang. It was Celeste Rowan. Her voice flowed through the receiver like warm honey, inviting me up to her executive suite for a brief, informal chat. When I walked into her sprawling office overlooking the bay, she was standing by the window, projecting the flawless image of a deeply concerned mentor. She closed the heavy mahogany door, gesturing for me to sit on the plush leather sofa. She poured me a glass of sparkling water, sighing heavily as she sat across from me. Celeste reached out and placed her perfectly manicured hand over mine. She lowered her voice to a sympathetic whisper. She told me she had seen the compliance notice and knew how exhausting my workload had been lately. She expertly wove a narrative of severe executive burnout, suggesting that perhaps I had been pushing myself too hard under the pressure of the disaster seasons. Then came the poison, wrapped beautifully in a velvet ribbon. She suggested I take a voluntary, temporary leave of absence. Just a few weeks, she claimed, to protect my mental health and shield the organization from any ugly public optics while the internal auditors sorted through the clerical errors. Every single word spilling from her mouth confirmed her absolute complicity. She was actively trying to isolate me from the servers. She needed to strip me of my administrative authority and physical presence in the building so she and Nolan could orchestrate the final phase of the frame job without any interference. I forced my eyes to well up with tears, mastering the physical reaction of a broken woman. I nodded weakly, thanking her for her profound kindness, and promised to seriously consider her advice before the end of the day. The manipulation at the office was entirely chilling, but the psychological warfare awaiting me at home was suffocating. That evening, Nolan greeted me not with his usual distant professionalism, but with an aggressive, overwhelming tenderness. He had cooked dinner himself. The rich scent of roasted rosemary chicken filled the kitchen. A bottle of incredibly expensive red wine was already breathing on the marble counter. He pulled me into a deep, consuming embrace the moment I walked through the door, kissing the top of my head and murmuring that he already knew about the audit. Celeste had supposedly called him out of deep personal concern for my well-being. We sat at the long dining table, and he played the role of the fierce, loving protector with terrifying perfection. He told me not to worry about the compliance review. He insisted it was just corporate theater, a standard procedure that got out of hand, and that he would personally handle all the legal strategy so I could simply rest. After we finished eating, he led me into the dimly lit living room and guided me to the sofa. He walked over to his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents printed on heavy bond paper. He placed them gently on the glass coffee table directly in front of me. I stared down at the crisp white pages. The top document was a comprehensive home refinance application. The second was a highly complex post-nuptial agreement. My stomach plummeted, but I kept my face frozen in an expression of confused panic. Nolan sat close beside me, wrapping his arms securely around my shoulders, his thumb rubbing soothing circles into my skin. He explained his strategy in a calm, deeply authoritative tone. He claimed that if the auditors decided to make a catastrophic mistake and refer my case to the state authorities, the government could immediately freeze every single one of our joint assets. To prevent us from losing everything we had built together, he needed to legally sever our financial ties on paper. The post-nuptial agreement would transfer the bulk of our liquid wealth and real estate into his sole name, shielding it entirely from any potential asset forfeiture. The refinance would pull the remaining equity out of the house, placing it in a secure offshore trust he exclusively controlled. He was trying to strip me completely bare. He was legally binding my hands, ensuring that when the federal hammer finally fell, I would not have a single dime to my name to hire a competent defense attorney. I looked up at him, letting my lower lip tremble violently. I asked him, my voice cracking with perfectly calibrated terror, if he truly believed I could be arrested. I asked if I was going to go to jail for mistakes I did not make. Nolan looked deep into my eyes, his expression a masterpiece of sorrow and unwavering determination. He stroked my cheek gently, wiping away a fabricated tear. He told me he would never let that happen to the woman he loved. He promised he had the best corporate lawyers on standby, but I had to trust him implicitly. He said I needed to sign exactly what he prepared, when he prepared it, to give him the absolute legal maneuverability to save my life. I leaned into his chest, burying my face in his cotton shirt to hide the absolute, violently burning disgust radiating through my veins. I whispered into the fabric that I trusted him completely. He kissed my forehead, thoroughly satisfied with my utter submission. He announced he was going to take a quick shower to clear his head before we reviewed the signature pages together. The moment I heard the master bathroom door click shut and the heavy rush of water hit the porcelain tiles, I threw off the blanket. I sprinted silently up the hardwood stairs toward his private dressing room. I had noticed a small, seemingly insignificant detail the previous week. Whenever he dressed for highly important investor meetings, he always opened a specific lacquered wooden box on his vanity to select his cufflinks. I slipped into the dark closet, moving silently past rows of tailored suits. I found the smooth wooden box resting on the cold marble counter. I popped the delicate brass latch and lifted the lid. Nestled among the silver and gold studs, tucked securely under a layer of black velvet lining, was a small, heavy brass key. I picked it up, feeling the cold, jagged metal against my palm. The teeth were perfectly aligned, the head square and dull. It was the exact make and model of the padlock key I had discovered hidden inside the floorboard cavity in his office. My mind raced, piecing together the massive significance of this duplicate. I pulled out my prepaid burner phone and quickly typed a secure message to Nina, describing the object in exact detail. Her response came back exactly 3 minutes later. She confirmed my absolute worst suspicion. She stated it was undeniably a key to a high-security private storage facility. It was the standard, predictable protocol for individuals orchestrating massive corporate fraud. They never kept the most damning evidence inside their own homes where a sudden, unannounced search warrant could destroy them. They rented climate-controlled, anonymous units under fictitious corporate names to hide the raw hard copy files, the physical ledgers, the burner devices, and the original forged contracts they dared not digitize. I slipped the brass key deep into the pocket of my trousers. I grabbed a small, worthless silver tie clip from another compartment and dropped it into the empty indentation in the velvet, hoping the occupied space would prevent his eyes from immediately noticing the theft. I backed out of the dressing room, silently closed the door, and rapidly descended the stairs. I returned to my exact spot on the sofa, pulling the blanket over my lap just seconds before the sound of the shower ceased. Staring at the towering stack of legal documents waiting for my signature, the true, horrifying scope of his cruelty washed over me. This was no longer just a financial crime. Nolan was rushing to build an impenetrable, perfectly legal fortress around himself while simultaneously locking every single door that could lead to my salvation. He was aggressively setting the stage to force my hand, waiting for the exact moment I was so terrified of the federal investigation that I would willingly sign away my freedom, my family legacy, and my entire future just for the pathetic illusion of his protection. He thought he was expertly tightening the noose around my neck. He had absolutely no idea he had just handed me the master key to his total destruction. Nolan packed his leather overnight bag on a Thursday evening. He kissed my cheek, smelling of expensive cologne, and told me he had a critical investor meeting in Jacksonville that would keep him away until late the following afternoon. I stood in the driveway, waving like a dutiful wife, until his taillights disappeared down the street. The moment he was gone, the heavy suffocating pressure in my chest transformed into pure adrenaline. I had roughly 24 hours. I grabbed my keys, locked the estate, and drove to the address Nina had managed to trace using the serial number stamped on the stolen brass key. I picked Teresa up along the way. She sat in the passenger seat, her hands tightly gripping her worn purse, her silence a perfect mirror of my own intense focus. We arrived at a massive, nondescript climate-controlled storage facility on the industrial edge of the county. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed aggressively above the endless rows of corrugated metal doors. We navigated the labyrinth of concrete corridors until we stood before a dull gray door. I inserted the brass key into the heavy padlock. The cylinder turned smoothly, and the deadbolt gave a heavy, satisfying click. I grabbed the metal handle and pushed the door upward. The metallic screech echoed loudly through the empty hallway. We stepped into the stark, windowless room. I had expected a few filing cabinets, or perhaps a hidden safe containing financial ledgers. What I found was a sprawling, meticulously organized archive of human misery. The unit was packed from the floor to the ceiling with heavy-duty plastic storage bins and towering stacks of cardboard banker boxes. The stale, recycled air smelled strongly of dry paper and ozone. Teresa let out a sharp gasp, her hand flying up to cover her mouth as we took in the sheer volume of the evidence. We did not waste a single second. We pulled down the first row of boxes and ripped off the lids. The labels scrawled in thick black marker were not corporate acronyms or bank account numbers. They were the names of the most vulnerable working-class neighborhoods along the coast. They were the very communities Harbor Light Recovery Alliance was supposedly dedicated to saving. I opened a box labeled with the name of a historic coastal district that had been devastated by the last storm surge. Inside, I found hundreds of glossy photographs showing modest homes with minor wind damage or shallow, manageable flooding. Attached to every single photograph was an official municipal code inspection report. My blood ran completely cold as I read the inspector notes. Houses that structurally required only minor roof repairs or basic drywall replacement were aggressively stamped with severe red tags. They were officially condemned as structurally unsound and entirely uninhabitable. I dug further into the bin and found the missing link. Nestled between the property files was a clear plastic bag containing over a dozen discarded prepaid mobile phones and a handwritten ledger notebook. The ledger detailed massive cash kickbacks paid directly to 3 specific county building inspectors. The horrifying truth hit me with the force of a freight train. Nolan and Celeste had not merely waited for a disaster to strike to buy cheap land. They had actively weaponized the local government. They paid corrupt municipal inspectors to intentionally fail perfectly salvageable homes. The moment the terrified, displaced families received those devastating condemnation notices, Bay Haven Acquisitions would swoop in through shadow intermediaries. They offered desperate, exhausted homeowners immediate cash buyouts for pennies on the dollar, convincing them their property was totally worthless and dangerous to keep. As soon as the deed was legally transferred, Celeste would push the massive Harbor Light relief grants through the system using my forged digital signature, funneling public charity money to repair the very homes they had just stolen. Once the houses were beautifully renovated with donor funds, Bay Haven flipped the newly pristine real estate portfolios to massive corporate developers for astronomical, untraceable profits. I felt physically sick, a violent wave of nausea washing over me as the absolute depravity of my husband fully materialized. But the darkest corner of the storage unit held a box designated exclusively for me. It was a sleek black plastic bin sitting completely isolated on a metal shelf. I pried the lid off. The contents were a masterclass in psychological and legal assassination. Resting on top was a thick draft of a formal whistleblower complaint addressed directly to the state attorney general. It was authored by an anonymous concerned citizen. The language was meticulously crafted, laying out the entire fraudulent operation with terrifying accuracy, but carefully twisting the narrative to place me at the absolute center of the conspiracy. It detailed how I allegedly used my executive authority to manipulate the grant approvals, painting Nolan as a clueless, innocent spouse who had recently uncovered his wife's horrific financial crimes and tried to stop her. Beneath the complaint was a pristine, finalized draft of our divorce petition, ready to be filed the exact moment the federal agents raided my office. Next to the legal filings was a highly detailed public relations strategy. Nolan had outlined specific talking points for the media, scripting his own tragic press interviews. His handwritten notes explicitly instructed his future crisis managers to describe me as severely exhausted, wildly impulsive, and making entirely erratic decisions under the crushing pressure of my career. He was preparing to stand in front of news cameras and play the heartbroken, devastated husband who had desperately tried to save his mentally unstable wife, while I rotted in a federal penitentiary. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely hold the papers. I dropped the media plan and picked up a heavy leather-bound binder at the very bottom of the bin. I flipped it open. It was a master list of the affected properties, categorized by the names of the previous owners. As my eyes scanned down the endless columns of names, the sterile, corporate nature of the fraud suddenly shattered into intensely personal agony. I recognized those names. I recognized the addresses. During the darkest days following the hurricane, I had personally sat in my office and made phone calls to many of these exact families. I remembered the sound of a young mother weeping with relief on the phone when I promised her Harbor Light was processing a grant to fix her flooded foundation. I remembered an elderly veteran thanking me profusely, because he thought our charity was going to save the home he had built with his own two hands. I had offered them genuine comfort. I had given them hope. And all the while, my husband was using my name, my reputation, and my signature to orchestrate their total financial ruin. I had unwittingly been the smiling, reassuring face of the very machine that was destroying their lives. Teresa gently placed a hand on my shoulder, tears streaming silently down her weathered cheeks. She looked at the list, her eyes reflecting the same horrific realization. The air in the storage unit felt thick and heavy, but the suffocating panic that had haunted me for weeks completely evaporated. It was instantly replaced by a cold, blinding rage that burned with the absolute intensity of a dying star. From that precise moment, my vengeance ceased to be a simple domestic retaliation against a cheating, greedy husband. This was no longer just about protecting my own freedom or saving my mother's land from developers. It had escalated into a total, unyielding war. I carefully photographed every single page of the inspector ledgers, the whistleblower draft, and the tragic list of stolen homes. I was going to systematically dismantle his entire empire, rip away his pristine reputation, and burn his carefully constructed reality to the ground. I was going to reclaim my honor, and I was going to extract a brutal public justice for every single family he had broken. Before leaving the claustrophobic metal room, my eyes caught a faded, heavy stock envelope shoved entirely out of sight behind a stack of blank property deeds. It lacked the bold, arrogant black marker labels of the other storage boxes. I pulled it free, the thick paper rough and degraded against my fingertips. I broke the brittle seal and slid the heavy contents onto the cold concrete floor. It was a massive, professionally bound waterfront zoning analysis. The cover page bore the embossed crest of an anonymous private equity consortium. I crouched down under the harsh fluorescent lights, carefully turning the thick, glossy pages. I unfolded the large architectural schematics, tucked into the back pocket of the binding. They depicted a sprawling, multi-phase luxury commercial redevelopment spanning the entire southern inlet. The plans were breathtaking in their greed, but as I traced the intricate blueprints with my index finger, my hand stopped dead at the geographical center of the map. The entire megaproject relied on a single, extremely narrow land corridor to connect the massive inland parcels to the highly lucrative Bay Service Road. That tiny bottleneck strip of earth was shaded in a bright, demanding crimson ink. It was my mother's property. The sheer scale of the engineering reality hit me with the force of a physical blow. If the developers could not secure that specific connecting node, the entire multi-million-dollar project would have to reroute its primary access line through federally protected wetlands. That environmental detour would take years of intense litigation and would drastically slash the commercial value of every single isolated lot Bayhaven had spent months quietly hoarding. My mother's modest, weathered cottage was not just a piece of land they wanted to flip for a quick profit. It was the absolute structural linchpin required to make their entire coastal empire a reality. Without her 3 acres, their grand vision was completely worthless. I flipped to the executive summary to check the projected timeline of the proposal. My eyes locked onto the printed date at the top right corner. It read, October 14th, 2018. The air evaporated entirely from my lungs. I read the date again, whispering the year out loud to the empty room. It was over a year before Nolan and I ever went on our first date. It was long before he supposedly walked across a crowded ballroom floor and fell madly in love with me at first sight. A sickening wave of vertigo washed over me as my memory violently rewrote our entire history. I remembered that fateful night vividly. It was a high-society urban recovery fundraiser at a downtown luxury hotel. I remembered how he had approached my table with 2 glasses of expensive champagne, his smile impossibly warm and disarming. I remembered being utterly charmed by how much he seemingly knew about my specialized field, how deeply he empathized with the exhaustion of nonprofit work, and how he asked incredibly insightful questions about my family roots in the coastal district. It had felt like absolute destiny. It felt like meeting someone who finally understood the heavy burdens I carried on my shoulders. It was not destiny. It was a highly orchestrated intelligence-gathering operation. I dug frantically into the bottom of the envelope and pulled out a stapled packet of printed electronic correspondence. It was a lengthy email chain between Nolan and Celeste Rowan, dated weeks before that charity gala. Celeste had not played the role of a romantic matchmaker because she thought we would make a beautiful couple. Her messages were entirely clinical, stripped of any human warmth. She referred to me not as a friend or a colleague, but as the perfect acquisition target. She detailed my administrative rank within the relief fund and explicitly highlighted my sole ownership of the critical inlet property. The words printed on the page were a masterclass in sociopathic planning. Celeste wrote that I was notoriously stubborn about selling the family land to corporate buyers, but she also noted that I was deeply overworked, emotionally isolated, and perfectly primed for a supportive partner. She provided him with a complete psychological profile, handing him the exact keys to unlock my trust. She told him what books I read, what wine I drank, and exactly how to frame his own career to make him appear like a protector rather than a predator. He had studied me like a corporate dossier before he ever introduced himself. Every single tender memory we shared over the past 5 years instantly mutated into something filthy and grotesque. When my mother passed away 3 years ago, Nolan had been my absolute anchor. He had held me as I sobbed on the bathroom floor until the sun came up. He had patiently handled the funeral arrangements, the morbid paperwork, and the endless stream of grieving relatives. I had looked at him through swollen eyes and thanked the universe for giving me a husband who possessed such profound, unconditional love. But sitting on the floor of that storage unit, surrounded by the physical proof of his monstrous deceit, I realized he was not mourning with me. He was simply securing his investment. His patience, his late-night comforting whispers, his willingness to handle the estate details. They were all just calculated steps to ensure I eventually signed over the deed without a single second thought. Even my wedding day was completely tainted. I remembered walking down the aisle in my white silk dress, looking into his eyes and reciting my sacred vows, believing we were building a lifelong sanctuary together. He had held both of my hands and promised to protect me. In reality, he was standing at the altar mentally calculating profit margins, legally binding his corporate shield to his chosen scapegoat. The betrayal was so absolute, so fundamentally invasive, that it bypassed ordinary heartbreak entirely. It felt as though a stranger had reached deep into my chest, ripped out my most sacred memories, and smeared them in absolute filth. The pain was a physical, crushing weight that made it nearly impossible to draw breath. I collapsed forward, my hands pressing flat against the cold concrete floor. I was trembling violently, but I made absolutely no sound. I had given this man my body, my deepest fears, my entire career, and my complete devotion. I had loved him with every fiber of my being, and I was merely a heavily scrutinized line item on his corporate balance sheet. The insult was so profound it defied human language. But as I knelt there in the dust and the fluorescent light, the agonizing humiliation of being played for an absolute fool began to harden. The violent trembling in my shoulders slowly subsided. The heat of my tears turned into an icy, impenetrable armor. I wiped my face with the back of my sleeve and stood up. If my husband viewed the sacrament of marriage as nothing more than a strategic business transaction, then I was going to respect his rules of engagement. He thought he had successfully merged our assets and acquired my utility for his grand design. He thought he could write me off as an acceptable loss. I gathered the printed emails and the zoning analysis, carefully positioning them under the light to capture perfect, high-resolution photographs with my phone. I was going to close this account. I would not scream. I would not confront him in our kitchen and demand an explanation. I would simply become the most lethal liability he had ever unknowingly acquired. If he wanted to play the ruthless corporate raider, I was going to teach him the devastating reality of a hostile takeover. I was going to make sure the severance cost him absolutely everything he had ever valued. The Harbor Light Recovery Alliance annual fundraising gala was scheduled for the second Saturday of November. The evening air rolling off the bay was crisp and aggressively biting. entirely fitting for the cold-blooded theater we were about to perform. I sat at my vanity mirror in our master bedroom, deliberately applying my makeup with a heavy, uncharacteristic hand. I intentionally skipped the concealer under my eyes, ensuring the dark, bruised circles of my fabricated exhaustion were fully visible under the harsh bathroom lights. I chose a long, severe black evening gown with long sleeves and a high neckline. It felt significantly less like formal wear and more like a heavy mourning dress tailored for my own funeral. Nolan walked into the bedroom just as I was fastening a simple pearl necklace. He looked absolutely immaculate in a tailored midnight blue tuxedo, radiating the effortless confidence of a man completely in control of his universe. He adjusted his silk bow tie in the mirror before turning his predatory gaze toward me. He crossed the room and knelt beside my chair, placing his large, remarkably warm hands over my trembling fingers. His voice was a masterful display of calculated empathy, soft and vibrating with entirely manufactured concern. He told me he had spent the last 3 days working back channels with his private legal team, burning every favor he had to protect me. He claimed he had finally secured an out, a narrow escape hatch from the looming compliance disaster. He explained the terms of his supposed rescue with the chilling, clinical detachment of a corporate hostage negotiator. He said the executive board was prepared to classify the missing relief funds as a massive administrative oversight, a tragic byproduct of an overworked executive buckling under the pressure of consecutive disaster seasons. But this grace period came with a brutal, non-negotiable price. He told me the state auditors needed a show of absolute good faith, a total restructuring of our personal assets to prove to the government that no public charity money had been hoarded in our private accounts. He leaned in so close I could smell the expensive gin on his breath. He whispered that the only way to permanently shield me from a devastating federal indictment was to immediately transfer my mother's inlet property to a holding company he managed, specifically Bayhaven. He promised he would handle the entire crisis, absorb the media blowback, and keep me out of a concrete prison cell, but only if I signed the transfer deed tonight, right after the speeches. The implication hung in the silent bedroom like a drawn blade pressing against my throat. If I was obedient and signed away my family legacy, I would be treated as a stressed, pitiful wife making a clerical error. If I fought him, he would ensure the audit instantly mutated into a vicious criminal case. I played my role flawlessly. I let my shoulders slump forward, dropping my gaze to the marble floor. I made my breathing shallow, ragged, and entirely erratic. I forced my voice to crack into a thin, pathetic whisper, asking him if he was absolutely sure this transfer would keep me safe from the police. He smiled, a sickening, patronizing display of patriarchal reassurance, and kissed my knuckles. I agreed to attend the gala. I agreed to hear his final offer in private. I gave him the exact, complete surrender he required to become fatally careless. The grand ballroom of the downtown waterfront hotel was a glittering, chaotic ocean of crystal chandeliers, towering floral arrangements, and clinking champagne flutes. The room was packed shoulder to shoulder with the most powerful figures in the entire county: wealthy philanthropic donors, aggressive real estate developers, senior partners from elite law firms, and key members of the local media circled each other like exceptionally well-dressed sharks. The air smelled of expensive floral perfume, roasted filet mignon, and melting wax, but beneath the opulent, charitable surface, the atmosphere was thick with a predatory anticipation. Everyone in that massive room was wearing a mask, but mine was the only one secretly rigged with a detonator. As Nolan guided me through the dense crowd, keeping his hand planted firmly on the small of my back to play the role of the fiercely protective husband, my eyes constantly scanned the perimeter of the room. Near the east service doors, holding a heavy silver tray of miniature crab cakes, stood Teresa. She wore the crisp black and white uniform of the hotel catering staff, her hair pulled back so tightly her face looked severe. We did not exchange a single glance, but her physical presence in that room was a steadying anchor against the rising tide of my adrenaline. Across the room, standing near a towering swan ice sculpture and casually nursing a glass of sparkling water, was a tall man in a slightly rumpled gray suit. Nina had provided me with his detailed physical description earlier that morning. He was the lead investigative reporter for the largest state newspaper, officially listed on the guest registry under a pseudonym as a potential private donor from out of state. The trap was fully populated and set. At exactly 8:30 in the evening, the string quartet ceased playing, and the massive crystal chandeliers dimmed to a soft golden glow. Celeste Rowan walked confidently up the brightly lit stage steps, adjusting the microphone with practiced, elegant ease. She looked radiant in a deep emerald gown, projecting the flawless image of a seasoned, deeply compassionate leader. She began her keynote address by praising the unyielding resilience of the coastal communities our charity served. The audience listened with rapt attention. But roughly 10 minutes into her eloquent speech, the entire tone subtly shifted. The projected warmth vanished, replaced by a grave, highly theatrical sorrow. She began speaking in measured, deeply careful sentences about the crushing, invisible weight of executive leadership during times of unprecedented natural disaster. She talked about how the sheer volume of human trauma could sometimes quietly fracture even the most dedicated and brilliant administrative minds. Without ever uttering my actual name, Celeste started laying the public groundwork for my complete professional and legal destruction. She hinted heavily at unfortunate, systemic deviations in our internal protocols, using calculated phrases like catastrophic executive burnout and tragic lapses in financial judgment. She was looking out at the sea of wealthy donors, meticulously painting me as a cautionary tale of a woman who simply broke under the pressure and compromised the integrity of the entire relief fund. Nolan squeezed my hand tightly under the table, whispering in my ear that I needed to stay strong, acting as if she were delivering a painful eulogy I had to bravely endure. As the audience erupted into polite, solemn applause at the conclusion of her speech, Nolan did not waste a single second. He leaned down and whispered against my temple that it was finally time to end this nightmare. He stood up, placing his hand firmly on my arm, and guided me away from our prime table. He steered me through the dense crowd and toward a set of heavy oak double doors leading to the private executive meeting suites situated directly behind the main ballroom. The immediate contrast between the roaring, music-filled gala and the dead, soundproofed silence of the private room was incredibly jarring. The space was purely functional, furnished with a long, heavy mahogany conference table and dark leather executive chairs. Nolan closed the heavy oak door behind us, throwing the brass deadbolt with a sharp, definitive click that echoed off the bare walls. The protective, loving husband persona he had worn all evening instantly evaporated into the chilled, air-conditioned room. What remained was nothing but the cold, calculating corporate raider. He walked purposefully over to the mahogany table and unzipped his sleek black leather portfolio. He pulled out a thick stack of legal documents and laid them perfectly flat under the recessed ceiling lights. It was the irrevocable transfer deed for my mother's property, completely drawn up and waiting for my signature. He uncapped a heavy gold fountain pen and placed it deliberately next to the final signature line on the last page. He did not ask me how I was feeling. He did not offer any further comfort. He looked up at me, resting his palms flat against the edge of the table. He was not looking at his wife of 5 years. He was looking at a successfully negotiated, highly lucrative corporate acquisition. He smiled, his dark eyes gleaming with the absolute, intoxicating thrill of a man who firmly believed he was just one single stroke of a pen away from securing a massive coastal empire and a flawless human scapegoat. The heavy oak door clicked shut, sealing us inside the soundproofed executive suite. The instant the brass deadbolt slid into place, the loving, protective facade my husband had worn all evening dissolved completely into the chilled, recycled air. He did not sit down. He stood over the mahogany conference table, his broad shoulders squared, looking down at the transfer deed he had just placed under the recessed lighting. His dark eyes were devoid of any manufactured warmth. He looked at me with a profound, chilling boredom, the look of a man who was tired of dealing with an incompetent subordinate. He loosened his silk bow tie with a sharp tug and let out a harsh, mocking laugh that echoed off the bare walls. He told me to drop the pathetic, trembling victim act. He stated, his voice laced with absolute venom, that I had never understood the reality of the game we were playing. He paced the length of the room, his polished leather shoes clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. He said people like me, people who believed the world operated on good intentions and charitable grants, were fundamentally weak. He told me I was only ever useful to him for two specific reasons: my ability to sign my name on the correct line, and my predictable tendency to stay quietly in my lane. I kept my head bowed, forcing my shoulders to tremble violently. I needed him to keep talking. I needed him to feel so completely untouchable that he would gladly undo himself with his own arrogance. I asked him, my voice a thin, ragged whisper, why he had to involve my mother's home. I asked him why he could not just leave my family out of his business. Nolan stopped pacing and leaned heavily across the table, his face just inches from mine. He sneered, his upper lip curling in pure disgust. He explicitly confessed that the coastal plot was never just a piece of sentimental dirt to him. He called the property a wasted, rotting patch of weeds sitting squarely in the middle of a commercial gold mine. He aggressively admitted that he had personally drafted the internal audit exposure sequence and forged my digital signatures because he needed a spotless, highly credible executive to absorb the devastating impact of the federal investigation. He bragged about how easy it was to bribe the municipal inspectors, laughing at how quickly the desperate, displaced families had surrendered their condemned homes for absolute pennies. Then, he delivered the final, fatal blow to whatever lingering ghost of our marriage remained. He mocked me for ever calling our relationship love. He looked directly into my tear-filled eyes and stated that our entire life together was nothing more than a highly calculated corporate acquisition. He said he had targeted me, acquired my assets, utilized my administrative clearance, and was now successfully liquidating the liability before the government could intervene. I reached up with a trembling hand, pretending to nervously adjust the collar of my black evening gown. My fingers lightly brushed against the heavy vintage silver and onyx brooch pinned near my collarbone. It was not a family heirloom. It was a military-grade, hypersensitive wireless microphone provided by Nina Barrett earlier that afternoon. Nolan picked up the heavy gold fountain pen from the table and aggressively shoved it into my palm, his fingers digging painfully into my skin. He commanded me to sign the deed immediately, threatening that if I delayed for even one more second, he would personally ensure the financial police were waiting at my office desk by Monday morning. I did not take the cap off the pen. Instead, I simply stopped shaking. I straightened my spine, rolling my shoulders back as the fabricated panic instantly vanished from my face. I looked him dead in the eye, my expression entirely cold and completely empty. Before he could process the sudden, terrifying shift in my demeanor, the ambient, muffled sounds of the gala outside abruptly changed. The faint, rhythmic bass of the jazz quartet was violently cut off. A sharp, ear-piercing whine of electronic microphone feedback ripped through the walls of our suite. Then, an incredibly loud, booming voice echoed from the massive concert speakers suspended in the grand ballroom. It was his voice. It was the exact audio of the conversation that had just occurred in our private room, broadcasted live to a room packed with hundreds of the most powerful politicians, wealthy donors, and law enforcement officials in the state. The entire gala heard him brag about the forged digital signatures. They heard him explicitly detail the bribery of the municipal building inspectors. They heard him confess to intentionally destroying working-class families just to acquire their land for his commercial real estate developers. Nolan froze. The color drained from his handsome face so rapidly, he looked like a corpse. His mouth opened, but absolutely no sound came out. The pen slipped from his hand and clattered loudly against the polished mahogany wood. The heavy brass handle of the oak door suddenly rattled violently. A master key turned in the lock, and the door was thrown wide open. Nina Barrett strode into the room. She did not look like a corporate attorney. She looked like an executioner. Flanking her on either side were the state attorney general's lead senior investigator and two uniformed financial crimes detectives. Behind them stood the investigative journalist, a digital audio recorder held high in his hand, and standing quietly in the back, her head held incredibly high, was Teresa. She was not alone. Flanking our former housekeeper were three older homeowners, the very people whose lives had been decimated by Bayhaven's fraudulent condemnation scheme. They looked at Nolan with a silent, devastating fury that completely stripped away his power. Through the open doorway, I could see the chaos erupting in the opulent lobby. Celeste Rowan, still wearing her glittering emerald gown, was frantically trying to push her way toward the valet exit. Two plainclothes detectives seamlessly intercepted her. Even from the private room, I could hear the investigator loudly announcing the immediate execution of search warrants for her personal electronic devices, citing massive financial fraud, the forgery of public documents, and the orchestrated theft of disaster relief funds. Nolan slowly turned his head back to me. He looked at me as if I were an alien creature he was seeing for the very first time. The horrifying realization finally washed over his eyes. The woman he thought he had successfully backed into a terrifying corner. The naive wife he believed he could easily sacrifice to the federal auditors had methodically transformed his ultimate stage of victory into a public guillotine. I did not scream at him. I did not slap his face or give him the satisfaction of an emotional, dramatic breakdown. I simply placed the heavy gold pen back onto the table. I looked at him, standing exposed and completely ruined in front of the authorities and the very victims he had mocked. My voice was calm, perfectly steady, and cold as ice. I told him he did not lose me tonight. I told him he lost the only thing he truly loved most in this world, which was his absolute control. The aftermath was a swift and brutal legal demolition. By the following morning, every single corporate asset tied to Bayhaven Acquisitions and its shadow subsidiaries was completely frozen by state and federal authorities. My terrifying internal audit file was immediately reclassified. I was no longer the prime suspect. I had been granted immunity and had become their primary cooperating witness. Harbor Light Recovery Alliance was forced by the state to launch a massive, independent public investigation into the executive board, terminating Celeste Rowan immediately and turning her administrative files over to the district attorney. Nolan was remanded into federal custody without the option of bail. His pristine reputation annihilated overnight, his powerful friends abandoning him the second the audio broadcast hit the morning news cycle. I did not just keep my mother's land, I weaponized it. 2 years later, after the massive civil asset forfeiture settlements were finalized and the stolen funds were painfully clawed back from the commercial developers, I used my portion of the punitive damages to build something entirely new. I constructed a sprawling, state-of-the-art legal and housing advocacy center directly on those 3 acres of pristine waterfront property. The foundation was dedicated entirely to providing free, aggressive legal representation for vulnerable coastal families facing fraudulent evictions and predatory corporate land grabs. My ultimate revenge was not simply watching my husband trade his tailored suits for a prison uniform. My true vengeance was taking the exact criminal machinery he designed to profit from human suffering and forging it into an unbreakable shield to protect the very people he had tried to destroy. Thank you for listening to my story. Please comment below to let me know where you are listening from so we can interact and share our thoughts. And I invite you to subscribe to the Daisy Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support it further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by even more people.